Welcome to this seminar looking at AI governance pathways across the Africa Middle East region. My name is Fola Adeleke. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Center on AI Governance. We are so grateful that you've taken time out to join us in today's conversation. The goal of today's conversation really is to launch a white paper we've been working on looking at AI governance alignment in Africa, Middle East, and Turkey. As you all know, AI continues to dominate the discourse across the globe, and different governments are adopting diverse AI governance approaches shaped by their political economies, their institutional capacities, and their strategic priorities. And the report that we are going to be discussing today examined AI regulation across 19 countries by asking why states adopt particular governance approaches, how they implement them, and what structural conditions shape these outcomes. The analysis was conducted by a group of 11 experts who are the primary authors of these reports and were selected based on their deep expertise in the region that they work in Africa, Middle East, and Turkey, as well as in the different areas of research that they do. And this work was funded by Meta, who has done some significant work in this region in promoting open source AI. The analysis of our work shows that regulatory orientation is inseparable from material capacity. We identified different models that have been adopted by states. We have state-centric models, right-centric approaches, and economic-centric strategies, which all appear across the 19 countries we looked at. But the effectiveness essentially depends on the institutional and fiscal foundations in each country. So we have some resource-rich developmental states who are able to operationalize their sovereignty, and we have some hub aspirant countries in the Africa region in particular who are balancing openness, economic openness with autonomy and capacity constrained jurisdictions where legislative ambition sometimes is outpacing the implementation of AI adoption. And in our analysis, there are essentially two paradigms we identified to frame the debates. Responsible AI is the first one, which emphasizes procedural safeguards within existing power structures. And then we also looked at decolonial AI, which we are going to explain shortly, that focuses on control over knowledge production, development trajectories, and whose interests AI ultimately serves. But overall, most of the countries we looked at attempt a hybrid approach. But the tension often remains unresolved because each paradigm answers a different question. Responsible AI focuses on responsible development, while the colonial AI centers on ownership and benefit distribution. So you essentially have a sovereignty paradox that runs through pretty much all the countries we looked at. States are asserting control through localization, through domestic research and development mandates, through regulatory autonomy, but their material position often limits what they can enforce. You have heavy dependence on foreign cloud infrastructure, on even implementation capacity, and the high cost of autonomous development turns some sovereignty claims into new forms of vulnerability. So you have sovereignty risks becoming a disadvantage when it fragments regional markets or imposes obligations states cannot really support. We proceed to identify some practical pathways that we think states can potentially navigate to achieve some of their objectives that they state in their national AI strategies and emerging governance frameworks. We have regional sovereign cloud centers which achieve scale while preserving collective control. Federated learning, which enables shared model development without centralizing data. Cultural calibration, which allows states to adapt global-based models to local contexts at manageable costs and avoiding this false binary between full autonomy and dependency. So these approaches reflect what we call a polycentric sovereignty model that aligns the countries we looked at with their political and economic realities. We recognize that persistent gaps also potentially remain as enforcement mechanisms are weak and accountability infrastructure is underdeveloped. But there's a crucial role for different stakeholders. Civil society participation will collaborate with better responsible AI outcomes. We recognize that there's an increase in talent loss, which continues to erode domestic capabilities. And we've spoken about, some of the global supply chain dependencies that exist in these countries. But that then suggests that there's a role for international governance. And the existing fora often exclude perspectives from Africa, Middle East, and Turkey, reducing, different the ability of some of these fora to indeed reflect global norms. So we recognize that success cannot be measured by strategy production or deployment velocity alone. The states we look at, which are often in a developmental position, must repair or at the very least match rapid adoption with right protections. Countries need to convert innovation ecosystems into sovereign capabilities. Capacity constrained states need to translate frameworks into practice through institutional strengthening. And we believe that regionally success will often depend on collective bargaining power, harmonized standards compatible with sovereignty aims, and infrastructure that can expand rather than restrict policy space. So, joining us in today's conversation are three excellent speakers who worked with us on this project. Um, Tara is the first speaker that we're going to be hearing from today. Tara Fishback has works for Meta as a public policy manager for the Middle East region. And it was really an initiative that led to the production of this white paper. And you might be curious on why we have grouped 19 countries into this phrasing of Africa, Middle East, and Turkey. So I think we should start off our conversation, with that specific question, Tara. For a global company like Meta, what prompted the focus on AI governance alignment across Africa, Middle East, and Turkey at this moment?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Fola, for the introduction, and I want to thank the center for partnering with us on this project. Um, so at Meta, we had made a number of years ago a decision to create a region that combines Africa, Middle East, and Turkey together into one sub-region in the same way that South America is kind of combined together, Europe, etc. And the reason being is really that we felt at Meta, at least, that there were some shared structural realities, political realities, economic realities, and that there was a lot of historical interplay between some of these countries. So we've kind of created this AMET region at Meta, and we have found a lot of interesting parallels and alignment between the different contexts across the region, even though they are vastly different and represent the largest region in terms of countries and languages spoken, etc. I think that we're dealing with as a tech company. But when we were drawn to focusing on AI governance alignment across this region, there were many interconnected factors that drove this focus. Among them is the kind of historical open source approach that Llama has taken, has, you know, driven similar patterns of adoption and trust across the region. And we found ourselves kind of engaging with different challenges or different considerations coming up across AMET that needed further study. We also recognized that AI development and governance conversations could skew towards approaches or perspectives that were driven primarily from Western contexts, and we felt the region maybe shared this perspective. Within the public policy team at AMET, I've been working primarily, we also felt it was our responsibility to ensure that Meta's models were not only safe and accessible, but that we can provide accurate insights into how local communities were and national governments were looking at governance when we're thinking across the region, and if there are any trends that are kind of shaping across the region overall or patterns of when we're thinking about governance. Um, we believe at Meta that governance is a critical enabler, not just for adoption of AI, but also for the diffusion of AI across different sectors. We understand that the environment or the governance landscape in AMET is at a nascent but also a pivotal juncture. Um, there hasn't, been an effort that has been super comprehensive, standalone AI legislation across the region. Many countries have different national AI strategies, and although, as the report mentioned, implementation mechanisms are varied. Um, we at Meta, I think the perspective has been that there is a risk of fragmentation or restrictive regulations that could come out across the region that would make it, challenging for us to have a more holistic approach. So we felt it was a crucial opportunity to understand proactively and engage with the different stakeholders on the ground who are working on shaping a more harmonized and pro-innovation approach across AMET. We really feel strongly that this constructive early engagement allows us to advocate for governance that enables innovation while also protecting our users' rights and their ability to use different products. Um, we really feel strongly that governance in AI governance in AMET should enable adoption and enable local ecosystems to grow, especially where capacity and infrastructure are still developing. So just as a summary, I think our commitment at Meta is to building and innovating in AI and bringing that innovation to AMET in a way that is holistic, collaborative, and long-term, so that we can play a critical role in boosting innovation and empowering communities across the whole of AMET. And we believe that doing this, at least as a policy team, and also we're driving the company towards investing in increased engagement, increased collaboration with partners like yourselves and others to really try to understand more localized perspectives on topics related to AI, but AI governance is obviously the topic for today's conversation.
Thank you, Tara. And I see you've used the word AI governance, which I really like because, governance certainly has a broader meaning. It doesn't just mean regulation. It's an acknowledgement that different stakeholders are involved when it comes to accountability and oversight in relation to AI. And so there's an important role for private for the private sector and tech companies to also adapt, you know, um, internal mechanisms to ensure equitable AI adoption. But also quite keen to understand why alignment is a perhaps more useful goal than full harmonization when discussing AI governance across the AMET region because, when you are in spaces like this, there's often conversations around the need to reduce compliance costs. And so harmonization should be a path that, should be pursued in terms of regulations at the very least. But this white paper is focusing more on alignment, and not full harmonization. Can you comment on that?
Yes, thank you. I think, as you said, I think we generally have advocated for harmonization. But understandably, in the context of AMET and its like vast diversity, pursuing alignment in AI governance can be more pragmatic, certainly, than full harmonization. And I think I do agree that this approach acknowledges each country or local context unique characteristics while fostering a more cohesive and interoperable regional AI ecosystem that respects different cultural norms or local contexts, commitment to innovation, capacity, etc., and what can be like more achievable in this kind of context. We recognize that there are many disparities across the region. And that AI governance has to be locally grounded, and we really, understand and I think at the regional level we agree that it shouldn't be just it should be locally created and not just like an imported vision. We really think that responsible AI innovation emerges from building trust and enabling diverse stakeholders to be involved in the process. And we recognize that there's no single answer to this question or like a right model that will, be suitable for everybody. Um, we see that alignment respects the strong desire for digital sovereignty across the region, which means, different things to different people, and that, and a focus on alignment may enable a more dynamic kind of AI ecosystem across the region of AMET as a whole. Um, I think if there are within alignment, I think, a shared um, perspective on kind of core principles that promote interoperability, reduce fragmentation, without creating like a monolithic framework, could definitely create a more predictable environment for businesses and also for innovators that are hoping to kind of work across the region. Um, Definitely, as you mentioned, as a tech company, with our scale specifically, who's producing AI technologies, navigating more complex environments requires us to be adaptable and also principled and can create like logistical challenges. Um, Alignment can, rather than rigid harmonization, can still give us better signals about how to enable our products to respond to local needs while remaining consistent in terms of safety and quality controls and standards. Um, it also alignment also allows us to engage constructively with multiple governments, different stakeholders with different regulatory requirements, and hopefully with the aim of reducing compliance complexity. And we hope to be able to continue to do that. I think first step is, as we have done in this effort, is really understanding the different tensions and perspectives, and hopefully we can have more constructive conversations going forward.
Thank you so much, Tara. Uh, Something I picked up from what you just said, and I think ties in with the work you've done, Professor Fodo, is Tara's comment that said, alignment respects the desire for digital sovereignty. So, for those who don't know, Professor Jeke Fodo is an assistant professor of technology law and AI at Toronto Metropolitan University. He has published widely in the space of AI, and his work has truly influenced the AI governance landscape. Professor Efodu is a critical partner for the Global Center on AI Governance. Welcome. Thank you for your work on this report. So picking up from what Tara essentially said about You know, these state desires for digital sovereignty, you advocated for a, an analytical approach within the report that focused on decolonial AI governance. So the report develops a framing around responsible and decolonial AI governance as an important outcome for states, particularly in the African region, to pursue. And the term responsible AI governance is very well established and has been used in global conversations. But decolonial AI governance is something still relatively novel. Can you explain the meaning of decolonial AI governance and provide some examples of this to distinguish it from responsible AI governance?
Good. I really love that question, Professor Fola, and thank you so much. Congrats to the center for publishing this unprecedented work. I don't think we've seen anything like this before. And, thank you so much, Tara, for actually setting the pace around this conversation on alignment. Because I think if we look at the theory of alignment in law, we are looking at the opportunity to have congruence between states, between governmental outputs, but also congruence in terms of preferences. So we're seeing the AMET congruence when it comes to a method of how do we want to regulate artificial intelligence. We're talking about the need for a majoritarian or a collective approach towards it. And if you could see, there's a lot of conversation around middle countries, middle powers taking shape in the international sphere. I feel like there is a polarization around global powers when it comes to governance or international law. So thank you so much, Tara, for making that clear. To answer what we mean by decolonial, sometimes people ask me, is it not the same thing, decolonial, anti-colonial, post-colonial? Are we not just trying to challenge some colonial epistemology? And there is a difference, even though there's some form of interrelatedness. When we talk about anti-colonial, for example, we're really talking about how do we resist colonial rule, which I think we technically have done. I mean, if we look at the 19th and 20th century liberation struggles, the focus was on self-determination. The focus was more nationalist in orientation. But then the post-colonial, when we talk about post-colonial perspective, we're looking at more around the cultural or discursive legacies of colonialism. So we will say things around like representation or knowledge or language or identity, or sometimes we talk about hybridity, that, oh, Africa's way of governing also matters as much as the Western way of governing also matters. But decolonial is strategic because it's about two things. One is dismantling the enduring structures of coloniality. And I think this is very relevant for artificial intelligence because it's not just government. We need like Meta, private sector to also get in the buy-in of how do we change the systems that are fundamentally powerful in the ways that they affect the lives of people in our region, in our AMET region. So when we use decolonial within, AI, and when we specifically look at it for the African continent, we're looking at how do we rebuild AI ecosystems on pluriversal foundations? How do we recognize the diversity, the complexity of issues in the region? And how do we by ourselves, not just wait for some law to be handed to us, how do we by ourselves begin to craft? How do we embed what responsible AI, how norm setting for governing this technology would be for us? So it's more about for us by us, removing the Eurocentric top-down model, removing the international from a region that is not really understood and that carries a lot of undersampled populations. By undersampled, meaning that, we're not the ones who develop the technology the most, we're not the ones represented in the technology the most. All the normative assumptions around AI seems to come from US or EU regulatory logics. So it's very important to talk about this, the need for why we're looking at the decolonial lens. And it engages these two paradigms around responsible AI or decolonial AI. And it's not just like, two sides to a coin. They do have symbiosis. But responsible AI, just like Tara alluded to, and you alluded to it as well, Professor Fola, it's pretty much how should AI be developed responsibly. So we've heard things like bias mitigation, transparency, explainability, accountability. But it's responsible AI is always within institutional structures. It assumes that the current architecture is fine. But then just what do we need to do? What technical or procedural safeguards do we need to introduce? Decolonial asks something very different. It asks more like a prior question, and it goes far to say who controls AI development and for whose benefit. So decolonial AI, like from the report, we're challenging this assumption of neutrality, of objectivity. We're happy to interrogate. We're happy to start from the very beginning. Let's assume there is no law in the AMET region. Who do we partner with? Is Turkey bringing the chips? Is Ghana bringing the data analysis? Is Nigeria bringing the procurement norms or model? So responsible AI is more reformist, and I would say decolonial AI is more structural. Um, Maybe I can give an example like responsible AI is almost like you're working within the house. The house is already here. How do we design it? How do we build it? But decolonial AI is not inimical to that, but it will ask, who built this house? Is it a rent? Is it a mortgage? Who owns it? Who gets to live in it? What room gets to be the kitchen? What rooms gets to be, the parlor? But this is decolonial AI is a much harder task, but is a more critical, more important stake for the African region. And I'll conclude by emphasizing this point, which is made in the report. The continent's engagement with AI is not happening on a blank slate. Colonial legacies, even though they're not sometimes not argued as harmful or as colonial as they say, maybe let me say imperialist legacies, um, also touch on these governance frameworks, the dependencies, the developmental paths, the constraints around electricity, around data, around software, around extraction. All of these things are very important, and we cannot talk about governance if we don't interrogate some of those. And I'll just quickly round up by saying, from the report, you can see that we are seeing what I call modest harvest, small sprouts of exemplification of decolonial AI on the African continent. We can see Nigeria's Fair Data Compensation Bill, which is trying to relocate, has a decolonial logic to relocate sovereignty. We can see Senegal's framing of the New Deal technologique. They migrated all government data and applications into a national data center. We've seen the African Union, the African Union's work, which has been mapped accurately by the center to show you that, this idea of digital sovereignty, data justice, African AI for African people, it is possible. And I'm happy that we are capturing all of this for the AMET region in this unprecedented report.
Thank you, Professor Jake. I love that distinction you made. Responsible AI governance is about reform. Decolonial AI governance is about, structural change. In practice, how does this then translate to the treatment of data, algorithms, institutional capacity, and even arguably financing
Mm.
in AMET context?
Very powerful, very excellent follow-up. I think um, the course I teach at my law school is called Critical Approaches to Data, Algorithms, and Science. And it was a very long title. And people say, just call it data science law, just call it AI and the law. But I refuse and emphasize that, data different, algorithms different, institutional capacity different. And they show how responsible and decolonial AI's models diverge in various concrete ways across the AMET region. For example, when we talk about data, we have to look at governance, but we also have to look at sovereignty, right? So responsible AI frameworks will treat data primarily as a governance challenge. You need consent mechanisms, you need privacy protections, you need quality standards and all of that. These are important. I mean, South Africa's POPIA or Kenya's DPA, or even our Nigerian Data Act, which is less than 2 years old. All of these provisions are important and they mirror what we see in the GDPR. But it requires the engagement of stakeholders like from Tara, from the center, academics, NGOs to come together to ask the deeper question around who owns the value that data generates. It's okay to regulate it, but who owns that value? Consider the infrastructure reality documented in the report, where Nigeria spends, I think 850 million annually on foreign cloud providers. So when Google launched the first Africa Cloud region in South Africa in 2024, countries without local hyperscale data centers began routing their data to South Africa, creating some new forms of, intracontinental dependency. So the data physically leaves one African country and lands in another, processed by a different company, governed by contractual terms, but responsible AI lens would ask, is the data being processed fairly? Are they following the DPA in Kenya? Are they complying with POPIA in South Africa? But the decolonial lens will ask a different question. What does this entire infrastructure ecosystem require that African data flows through foreign-owned pipes? Is it possible? Are there alternative ways for the AMET region to make it better, make it faster? Maybe not as efficient, but maybe more trustworthy, maybe less expensive, right? Especially considering the economic dynamics of the region. So this is why the concept of tiered sovereignty in the report is so important, and I can't wait for academics to delve into this idea that the report is proposing. And I think it proposes a firm national control over citizen data with coordinated regional rules for shared infrastructure, selective openness for research, foundational model development. So it's not stifling innovation. It's also not isolatism. It's actually, like Tara said, alignment in a way that is like a strategic calibration. It's exactly the kind of alignment, let me borrow Tara's word, that we need for our region, that is more economically advantageous, that allows us to grow at our own level, but does not shut us off, from the world. So the AFCFTA Digital Trade Protocol complicates this picture for us in a very instructive way. I think Article 20, or is it 21, mandates cross-border data flows for digital trade, but Article 10 restricts government from requiring source code disclosure. So you see, this kind of combination is like we're promoting openness, but we're also thinking about regulatory autonomy so that we're not, abused, or we don't see a replication of what previous technologies have done for us. So yes, responsible AI, fantastic, but decolonial AI as well, fantastic. It's like, rice and stew, beans and plantain, Turkey and Nigeria. We want to see that symbiosis when it comes to the approaches that we follow.
Thank you, Professor Jake. I never tire from listening to you. Really fascinating insights. My colleague, Professor Rachel Adams, is our next speaker. She is the CEO of GCG. She is also a research professor at the Leverhulme Center for Future of Intelligence at Cambridge University. And if any of you haven't read her work, The New Empire of AI, you should certainly grab a copy. Rachel, so we've heard from Jake the reason why we need to essentially think about responsible AI governance and decolonial AI governance as important approaches to have, a coherent, um, holistic, um, you know, system for AI oversight in the AMET region. But one thing that the report also does is identify three distinct approaches towards AI governance: a state-centric model, a human rights-centric model, and economic-centric approach. Are these approaches mutually exclusive, or do you think that, in your work, are hybrid models emerging, and which combinations appear most promising for this idea of alignment within the MS region?
Well, thank you so much, Fola, and thank you to all of you who have joined and for the amazing work on this report. I remember Tara speaking to you a number of months ago about the importance of making space to do this work, and I think the report shows just how valuable it is to do that kind of cross-regional analysis and be able to identify and pinpoint what is the kind of unique opportunities and challenges that face a region that is very, very, very diverse. Jake, never easy to follow you. Thank you so much for your remarks. I've got a lot from that and I've learned a lot. And I love this idea about modest harvests as well, to help us kind of feel encouraged that we are moving in the right direction and that there's amazing work going on in very different parts of the world. This is something we lead a project called the Global Index on Responsible AI, and that project, much as it's about ranking and measuring how governments around the world are performing against this idea of responsible AI, it's also about identifying and showcasing excellence from parts of the world where we're not used to seeing excellence showcased in a globally relevant way. And I think this report does this very, very well and then introduces a very useful analytical framework, not just in terms of the different typologies, but also in teasing out this idea of the paradox of sovereignty. I thought that was a very, very helpful concept. So thank you to all the authors for all the work and in doing that. I'm going to address your comment, Fola, but I just want to respond to Jake on the point around kind of what responsible AI is and isn't. Jake, I think you've done that very powerfully. I teach AI ethics at the University of Cambridge now, and so much of my own scholarship has been about how decolonial theories and practices allow us to problematize ideas that seem on the surface to be things that there can be nothing wrong with this idea. And one of those ideas is ethics as well. I think we assume that a set of ethical principles is all we might need to build technology that does good, but like Jake's critique of responsible AI, ethics first of all has a difficult history in terms of colonial practices were always justified as ethical and ethically good, but they also don't deal with the structural problems. And I think the report does a very good job of identifying the intersections between different governance arrangements and different regulatory approaches, and the structural challenges that they are both trying to address and that they are built on. So I'm going to answer your question, Fola. I really am. But I'm not going to kind of go over the typologies in detail. So the kind of the three different approaches of the state-centric approach, the economic growth kind of centered approach, and the human rights centered approach. I'd like to kind of shift this out slightly and ask a potentially deeper question around kind of power, capacity, and structural position of AMET countries in the global AI economy. AI governance is ultimately about who captures risk, who captures value, who absorbs risk, and I think this report has also shown very well who has the kind of institutional capacity and capabilities to shape governance outcomes over time. So one of the very clear things that we see in this report, we also saw it in our study on the Global Index on Responsible AI, is this gap between ambition and capacity. And I think this is something that's very interesting. It's surfaced in a very interesting way when you compare the different countries within the AMET region, governments that are producing strategies and frameworks, ethical principles, national AI plans, but the implementation gap between those ambitions and how far they are enacting meaningful change on the ground is really, really significant. So I think when we're asking whether hybrid models are emerging, definitely, I think across every single country, there's a blend of kind of new approaches to harness the economic potential of this technology that sit alongside both legacy older and new regimes around human rights protection, not just data protection, but freedom of expression and the realization of socioeconomic rights. And sometimes I think there's a very difficult, well, maybe it's not difficult, but there's certainly a blurring between economic growth and the human rights perspective, because human rights are also about the realization of socioeconomic rights, often in health, food security, and agriculture, education, and so on. So an economic growth centric model can still be human rights preserving if we're taking into account adequately enough the uneven distribution of benefits and the uneven access to these technologies, and how we try and balance that out and make for a more equitable AI for everybody. So I think one of the critical questions is around how these hybrid models might be sustained and enforced. Certainly in the Global Centre, we've been very focused on thinking about how do we build capacity within the independent institutions of democracy and our regulators, who across the African region have already been playing very, very significant roles in addressing market concentration or protecting data rights, or thinking about the human rights implications of AI technologies. And these institutions play the kind of translation role as well between government ambitions on very esoteric topics, really. AI is not like something that everybody across the continent is really thinking actively about. It matters more to some than it does to others, but regulators and independent institutions, state institutions, can play the kind of translation role between communities and society and between the state. So I think when we're thinking about how these new or hybrid models get sustained, we should be really thinking about how do we augment the already kind of outsized role that these institutions are playing. Now, of course, there are fiscal and infrastructural constraints as well that really shape what AI governance looks like in practice. And these fiscal and infrastructural constraints are very different if you're in the Gulf region, if you're in Africa. I think the point around sovereignty is a really important one for why the AMET region has something quite distinct in relation to other regions. So certainly in relation to the US, where most of these technologies arise from, where their companies are based, but also distinct from Europe, who is concerned about sovereignty, but has already responded in a regulatory form in terms of the AI Act and the kind of foundational rights and risk-based perspective there, much to the critique of the US. And I think very often it will not be unfamiliar for many of us in the room to be in conversations where we are blanketly told, don't adopt the European model. When I was working on the African Union's continental AI strategy, it was very interesting because there was a real kind of push to use the word regulation. Fola, you're very good at talking about that distinction between what is purely regulatory and what is regulation, as opposed to this much larger umbrella idea of governance. And Europe regulates, that's what they do. And they regulate through law. And there was a very significant push to ensure we use the word regulation from the commissioners in that strategy, but at the same time to ensure we weren't thinking about creating the conditions that would later result in a kind of African AI Act type of framework, which would not only impact foreign investment, but also, I think importantly, create too high a compliance burden that would inhibit, it would act as a kind of market filter for local AI innovations and ecosystems, which is what is so important to be supporting everywhere in the world, but certainly in the African region where we have such a huge diversity in terms of the needs AI can serve, the languages in which it needs to work, the cultural differences which really impact on whether a technology is safe or not, effective or not in very different communities across the continent. But of course, we still have kind of digital infrastructure that is not within our sovereign control. And this may not be contradictory. It's probably more like the development, the real politics of development at the moment. And I always like to remind people that sovereignty is not just about kind of control of infrastructure. Sovereignty is the capacity of states to protect the rights of their people. And that needs to be fundamental. But that also comes back to the issue of control, that they have the ability to govern the use of AI infrastructure within their jurisdictions in a way that is not harmful to their people. But it's a different kind of reframing. I think sovereignty has been something that's been very interestingly negotiated by the Gulf countries. And I think they're beginning to offer a different kind of model to African countries, as opposed to the kind of US or China model, offering compute alliances, offering kind of open source compute access, but the countries that might access it have the ability to shape the rules under which it is used. So I think that's very, very interesting. And I think the kind of role of the UAE and Saudi Arabia and others as a kind of convener of a new set of global bilateral or multilateral arrangements between countries is one that we really, really shouldn't underestimate. The UAE will be hosting the Global AI Summit in 2028. Switzerland is hosting it next year, but I think the year after that is going to be a very big moment when the UAE hosts that conference. I also agree on the point. Sorry, Fola, I'm coming to an end. I feel like I've been rambling, but I also agree on the points around we don't need total interoperability. Sometimes that just means that whoever's position is more dominant, their framework gets to apply everywhere. I think we need a set of shared principles. We need national control, certainly, over things like data, and I think that is well put. And then we need kind of regional alignment, which is where the regional bodies become really, really, really important. I think that's quite clearly articulated in the report. I think there's probably more that still needs to be done. Where I see a major gap is, I think we're very good across Africa, certainly, and other parts of AMET to be talking about the potential of artificial intelligence and how important it is to build the capacity to be able to harness all its possibilities for human development and human flourishing. But we need to be ensuring we have adequate and effective guardrails in place, and that these technologies are safe to use. And I think we still have much more work to do from a governance perspective to ensure that that is the case. The Global Centre on AI Governance conducted a study in South Africa. I'm sure many of you will know about it, to assess the degree to which South Africans knew about artificial intelligence, where they learned about AI from, what they were kind of worried about, what they were hopeful about. And the reality was that almost two-thirds of South Africans do not know about AI. One-third have never heard of AI. Another third have heard about it, but wouldn't be able to say at all what it meant. So I think recognizing that states across the region tend to be the largest procurers of AI systems, we are creating a really critical democratic gap between the rate of adoption of AI, particularly in the delivery of public services, and the lack of ability of citizens to be able to meaningfully contest and question them. And this ultimately kind of can impact big questions around trust, and safety. So I thought it might be useful just to highlight that as I close, and Fola, I will stop talking now. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Really fascinating insights, and you've begun to answer some of the questions in the chat. So, if alone were you had asked the question around, geopolitical tensions and how emerging nations might navigate competing influences from the EU, US, and China. And Rachel really already answered that question by talking about the role of middle powers like the UAE and how they are stepping up to serve as a counterbalance to the dominance of these three regions already. We are fast running out of time. I'm going to potentially only pick three questions. The first question really to you, Tara. If I know again, ask the questions about regulatory sandboxes, and I think that would be something that is quite interesting for a tech company like yours. We are increasingly seeing sandboxes being adopted by African states. In Nigeria, fintech industry has been one where Nigeria has used sandboxes quite a bit. And she's asking whether this idea of regulatory sandboxes, where you have different stakeholders, including a tech company like yours, coming to partner with government entities to design fit for purpose regulatory framework, could be scaled regionally to test AI applications in specific sectors. Do you have a response to that?
Yes, thank you for that question. So I hadn't prepared for such a question, so I don't have too much detail to offer on previous, like what Meta has been doing in the space, like in concrete, kind of examples. But what I will say is that we at Meta, we have engaged with regulatory sandboxes across different kind of areas of regulation, and this is something that we have been doing since my time at the company, really, which has been over 7 years now. We've engaged with these kinds of processes in different ways and in different formats, with the idea that I think from at least a meta perspective, there's always value in sharing, not only like a perspective that can obviously benefit the operations of the company and make it smoother to operate within that market, but also a lot of times we do see um, uh, uh, kind of benefit in sharing global perspectives that may be not as dominant or like well known in the region. So, for example, I think if we're talking about MENA specifically, which is or maybe AMET, I think as a whole, I think there's like a strong um, look towards EU regulations and EU frameworks for things, and so we do try to engage with regulatory sandboxes and present alternative models that are um, maybe offering a vision that could respond to governments' requirements or their concerns while also enabling us to operate in a way that's a bit easier, I would say. Um, in terms of specific regulatory sandboxes, I think across AMET, I can't really point to specifics, but I do know that we have been involved in some. I want to mention Jordan, for example, I think is one that has hosted a regulatory sandbox around AI, actually, I think, and was something that we involved with. So I think as a company, we're not opposed. It's something that we like to engage with and share perspectives. I hope that answered your question, but
Yeah, it certainly does, Itara. Thank you. Jake, several questions, but I think I'll only select one. And I think what is potentially most interesting is the one on from Tara that speaks about your views on the UNESCO Readiness Assessment methodology and the recently launched Tech Policy Assistance Facility. How can, you know, African states align with sharing their own experiences and expertise and avoid templated dissemination of Western style governance models?
I mean, very excellent question, and thanks to everyone for all the questions that have been submitted. I like what Rachel pointed out, this dynamic between ambition and capacity, like who captures values and who bears the risks. There's a lot that we can learn as a continent, knowing fully well that the African continent, or even just if you look at the diversity in the AMET region, we're seeing that we have states that are in the first industrial revolution, states in the second, states in the third, states in the fourth, all at the same time trying to navigate this new AI world. So the UNESCO readiness assessment methodology, I think it's an important institutional innovation. I think they acknowledge that countries need the kind of differentiated support that we've reported in this piece that we're launching today, that there is no one size fits all prescription. And I think that is progress. But picking on Rachel's point about the risk, the history of international technical assistance in Africa is sometimes littered with language of like instruments, assessments, methodologies, tools. But when they begin to function in practice, we sometimes see how they could slightly be vehicles for maybe transplanting some like models designed in Geneva or Paris or Washington. And I'm not saying that's bad, that's great, but sometimes they don't fit excellently. They might not, they fit quite poorly, knowing fully well that we're talking about a region that has language diversity of over like 1,000 languages, which will not be the same in the EU, so to speak. And I'm just saying that's just on language alone. So the GDPR shadow over the African data protection law is very instructive here. There is some imperialist remnants that we see. It's not by luck or by happenstance that most of the data laws we see in Africa seem to just model the GDPR, right? The Brussels effect seems to be alive. And it is also because it's a combination of direct legal transplants like this. Not to say that these frameworks are not good. Sometimes these frameworks do either not meet the needs of the region, don't meet it completely, or do not allow for that germinal process, that modest harvest to occur. So it's not to say, oh, do we scrap it and make our own? No, it's not every time we make our own. Like Rachel said, ambition and capacity. What do we have capacity for? And what can we learn? It's not just taking the assessment and saying this is what we'll use, as the Torah, as the Constitution. It's looking through and saying which ones work for us, which ones, would need us to tweak or amend or even say, okay, that one doesn't apply here. So I would suggest, maybe I'll suggest three concrete shifts. I think the first is these assessment frameworks, need to be co-designed with African institutions, and not just merely consulted on. I know UNESCO is big, they have the name, they have the power and all, but maybe there might be, like the Global Center here, maybe, local governmental organizations that deal with data and AI, and almost like here is an assessment tool. How would you replicate it? Or what? How has this tool worked for you in the last 2 to 3 years? What has changed? You can never be an expert at something without feedback. And I think it's not just how many states are using the tool, but how many states are using it in the way that you thought they were going to use it, and what aspects of this tool or, is working or not working for certain people. I think the second is about, I don't want to go into consultation versus co-authorship. I think it's, if you look at, the Global Index on Responsible AI, for example, which is developed by the center here, and you can see that there is a much more different model because it was built from within the region with an understanding that the pillars of assessments must reflect African realities. And this is why it captures things like, civil society participation, what other indices that are not typical from the UNESCO framework. Of course, both of them are great tools. You can oscillate between both of them. But if you see Egypt's, GIRAI score of 0.62 out of 100 on non-state actor participation, you would simply note that there is a visible assessment of an area that is different from like the Oxford Index, for example. So I like to say the UNESCO tool should not be seen as the pen to assess AI. We should see it like one color in the crayon box. That there's so many, and we can use the blue today. We can use UNESCO for that, and that's what we need more of the kinds of work that the center does. We need more and more of people breaking it down and saying, here's how we adapt to it. We need to see that south to south exchange, not just north to south transfer. And we're seeing it. We're seeing, like Rwanda's consultative approach to national AI policy. I think Tara mentioned Jordan's innovative use of their central bank framework and how the sandbox there was helping them to architect this AI-enabled financial market in a way that is different from what we see in like Lagos or in Kenya. So what I'm trying to say here is these instruments are still the first edition. And in my place, we say, let me speak pidgin. Who will buy first model? Who will buy the first? Now you buy the old model, right? The first person who buys a brand of a car is the person who bought the old model. And so I think we are grateful for the UNESCO guidelines and the benchmarking and all the tools it provides within the assessment framework. But we need to do more. We need to see the OECD. We need to see the Global Center. We need to see local people even creating their own tools, especially for the AMET region, where we see both, Islamic jurisprudential principles. We see some Middle Eastern context. We see some MENA, Middle East, North African, dynamics. We see the dynamics between Sub-Saharan Africa, South Africa, like Southern Africa versus Eastern, Western Africa. These different approaches should give us more colors in the crayon box. So yeah, kudos to the UNESCO principles again. I have no issues with it. For us, we just need to build more and build on what we already have. And we don't see these things as the Torah or like the Bible of when it comes to methodological assessments.
Thank you, Professor Jake. You are never short of analogies and very, very colorful analogies. And your message stays with the imagery is really powerful. We are at time. Thank you all for the wonderful engagements. I'm really grateful to Tara, to Rachel, to Jake, and to the audience with your insightful questions. We've posted the link to the report. We hope that you find it valuable in your own research. Thank you again, and hope you all have a lovely day.
Thank you very much, Professor Fola, for a great moderation.
Thank you. Cheers.
Yeah, thank you.